So what did happen in Gaza? Actually, the soldiers themselves came up with the best metaphors. One soldier said, "It was like hunting season has begun. Sometimes it reminds me of a PlayStation computer game." Another soldier said, "You feel like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ants." You feel like a child with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. I was a kid once. I had my magnifying glass. I used to focus the rays of the sun on the anthills. I'm not proud of it. I did turn the ants into crispy critters, but I wasn't so delusional as to think I was engaged in a war with the ants. And in fact, it was a very appropriate metaphor. Israel dropped white phosphorus in Gaza. I had heard about Israel's use of white phosphorus. I remember from as far back as the June 1982 invasion of Lebanon. But I had never really looked into the fine details. What is this white phosphorus? It had an ominous sound to it. But, well, I began to read about it. White phosphorus reaches a temperature of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 816 degrees Celsius. As Oprah would say, try wrapping your mind around that one. 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. What did Israel do with the white phosphorus? Well, the human rights organization Human Rights Watch put out a report. It was called, if my memory serves, Rain of Fire. And they said that Israel, and I'm quoting Human Rights Watch, repeatedly exploded white phosphorus munitions in the air over populated areas, killing and injuring civilians and damaging civilian structures. They dropped the white phosphorus in a school. They dropped it on a market. They dropped it on a humanitarian aid warehouse. They dropped it on 2 hospitals. They dropped white phosphorus in Al-Quds Hospital, and they dropped white phosphorus in Al-Wafa Hospital. According to Human Rights Watch, the hospitals were clearly marked, and there does not appear to have been fighting in that immediate area. By the end of those 22 days of death and destruction, about 1,400 Palestinians were killed. About 1,000 to 1,200 of those 1,400, between 1,000 and 1,200, were civilians. About 400 of them were children. On the other side, 13 Israelis were killed, 3 of them civilians, 10 combatants. And even of the 10 combatants, half of them were killed by others Israelis by accident, what's called friendly fire. So, for every 100 Palestinians killed, 1 Israeli was killed. For every 400 Palestinian civilians killed, 1 Israeli civilian was killed. 100 to 1, a 400 to 1. That's not a war. That's a bloodbath. That's a massacre. But it's most obviously not a war. But Israel and its defenders had an argument, or they claimed to have an argument. They said even acknowledging that there was a lot of death and destruction, you have to remember why. It was because of those fanatics in Gaza, those cowards in Gaza, those Islamic lunatics. They were using Palestinians as human shields. They were in a cowardly fashion hiding behind the Palestinians as they shot at the Israelis, in effect forcing the Israelis to kill Palestinian civilians against the Israelis' will. How many of you are acquainted with the claim that Hamas was engaged in human shielding in Gaza forcing Palestinians to hide behind them, Palestinian civilians. So raise your hands so we have a sense. So we can say nearly everybody in the room. In fact, you would have to be either suffering from a degenerative brain disease or be brain dead not to have heard that allegation. It was repeated so many times in the media. And in fact, all the human rights organizations investigated that claim. They investigated very closely. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Goldstone Mission, they all went through it very carefully when they went to Gaza to conduct their human rights investigations. They all reached the same conclusion. There's just no evidence that Hamas engaged in human shielding. To quote Amnesty International, contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. It just never happened. Now here's the interesting point. Nearly everyone in this room was aware that Israel claimed Hamas engaged in human shielding. Now, how many of you honestly are aware that every human rights organization which investigated the charge found no evidence of it? Raise your hand. Now look around the room. Bear in mind, this is an informed audience, and an audience which is mostly sympathetic to the Palestinians. And about two or three hands went up. It tells you something about the huge gap that exists between what public officials and the public media say and what's actually happening in the real world. Even if it were true, that Hamas engaged in human shielding, and it's not true, but even if it were true, it still could not account for why so many Palestinian civilians were killed. How come? Well, let's see what Amnesty International had to say. Quoting Amnesty again, the attacks that caused the greatest number of fatalities and injuries, the people were not caught in the crossfire of battles between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces. They were not victims of shielding. Many were killed when their homes were bombed while they slept. Others were going about their daily activities in their homes, sitting in their yard, hanging the laundry on the roof, when they were targeted in airstrikes or tank shelling. How did the children die? How those 400 children in Gaza died? Amnesty International says the children were studying or playing in their bedrooms or on the roof or outside their homes when they were struck by missiles or tank shells. All the human rights organizations reached basically the same conclusion, that Israel committed multiple war crimes and possibly or definitely crimes against humanity in Gaza, and Hamas committed comparable crimes, but on an incomparably smaller scale. After all, how many crimes can ants commit against a child, incinerating them with a magnifying glass? The best known of the human rights organization investigations, as most of you no doubt know, was the one conducted by Richard Goldstone, the respected South African jurist. And he concluded, and now I'm quoting him,